Now we're some 36 hours into this, and a retaliation from Iran is underway at this moment as they threaten the biggest waves yet attack on Israel and U.S. military bases. It also attacked shipping and threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz. Obviously, so very pivotal there, that energy artery there in the region. You can see this from G Captain saying the Strait of Hormuz is now a war zone. Tankers hit, 3 U.S. troops killed. The shipping giants halt Gulf transits. A war risk insurance pulled. 20% of global oil supply hangs in the balance. And this is just the first 36 hours of what's going on there. We're going to be joined right now by friend of the program, maritime expert, professor at Campbell University, Sal Mercogliano. Sal, thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Vox. Iran threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz. Is it closed now at this moment?
It's not closed right now, Andy, but what we're seeing is kind of a shutdown a bit. What happens right now is ships have pulled up on each side of the strait and they're waiting to go in. Because of the potential threat, ships have to reassess their war risk insurance. This is the insurance you get in case you are attacked on the high seas. And so what we're seeing really is a pause in shipping through the straits right now. While Iran has made overtures to closing the strait, they have not officially closed it. And while we have some attacks, we've seen at least 4 ships hit, and we do have a confirmation of a fatality on one ship. Ocean shipping has not really sailed away from the strait yet.
And how are they managing this? Because obviously we're still very early in this conflict. It could go on, as President Trump said, for some weeks. How are the different shipping companies, different nations managing this and watching this?
Well, right now it's kind of sit back and watch attitude. They're really kind of taking a pause. It's almost like, you're going into a neighborhood and there's shots being fired across the street. Everyone's kind of hunkered down right now to wait and see what happens. Unlike what we saw, for example, with the Houthi down in the Red Sea, there was an alternative route. You could head around Africa. You can all of a sudden go that way, and it was actually economically cheaper to go that way because of the escalating war risk insurance. The Strait of Hormuz is a cul-de-sac. You have to get in there to get not just 20% of the world's oil, but 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. I mean, sooner or later, ships are going to have to go through here. And this is exactly what we saw happen back in the 1980s during the tanker war, when over 400 vessels were hit and several hundred merchant mariners were killed. Unfortunately, economics is going to play a big factor here. And sooner or later, we're going to see ships start heading back through the straits, whether this conflict has stopped or not.
And how quickly does it happen that obviously some of this goes on? 20% of the world supply of oil there goes through this very narrow channel there. How quickly does it disrupt all of those supply chains?
Well, it's going to have a disruption right off the bat. I mean, I can expect Monday you're going to start seeing oil prices begin to spike. But one of the factors we really need to think about is the world supply of crude carriers. These are the large tankers that carry crude oil is already diminished because of so many of those vessels are in the sanctioned or the dark fleet. They can't do operations around the world. They're really restricted. What this means is already we saw the price to charter these very large crude carriers, these super tankers that can carry, over a million or 2 million barrels of oil, expand 3 times from $50,000 a day to $150,000 a day. And so what we can expect to see, unfortunately, is the gasoline market, diesel market is going to react to that. And we're going to start seeing prices come up. Big thing to remember is a lot of that oil that comes out of the Persian Gulf heads to East Asia and South Asia. That's really the big claimants for that oil.
Yeah, I was going to ask you exactly where it comes from and where it goes. Can you get into the specifics, just how vital this is and where it starts and where it ultimately ends up?
Sure. I mean, the biggest consumer of it is China. China consumes almost a third of the oil that comes out of the Persian Gulf. And that's a country we're really not talking about a lot here. But they have a massive impact if all of a sudden this oil is choked off from them. You got to throw in there Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, and India in particularly, too. Another country that gets a lot of that oil out of that region. Now, several of the countries in the region have some alternatives. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they have some pipeline systems that allow them to move oil without going through the straits. Iraq can go through their northern pipeline, but the oil in southern Iraq, in Kuwait, in Bahrain, Qatar, and the eastern side of Saudi Arabia and parts of the UAE have to come through the Straits of Hormuz. And really the one country that we need to talk about that's going to be the most impacted by a shutting down of the strait is Iran. Iran absolutely needs this oil to flow to fund their economy.
And when we're talking about this, obviously Iran there, Oman on the other side of it, if we're talking about insurance, talking about protection of the strip, who's in charge in that way? Is it the nation that they fly the flag of? Who potentially could be protecting these, and how much is the U.S. kind of monitoring that, potentially protecting some of these ships moving through?
Well, we know that U.S. Central Command through the combined.
Sal, you still with me? We're having a little tech issue right now. All right, it looks like we may have lost Sal, but nope, I think you might be popping back up.
Information Center is having an issue with providing enough assets and security to really escort vessels in. So right now, they're focused on strike missions. They're focused on their ability to attack. Defense of ocean shipping is not really primary yet, and it's really going to depend on how long this operation continues.
Yeah, that is obviously a little bit there of concern. I do want to ask you another component to this because we're talking about how the U.S. is striking Iran different targets there in the region. They've also said this, according to the president on social media, that they've informed that they've destroyed and sunk 9 Iranian naval vessels. So that was here on social media about this, and we're going after the rest. They will soon be floating at the bottom of the sea. How prominent of a navy does Iran have, and are ships concerned about them potentially being targeted or kind of in the midst of what's going on with this conflict in a war?
So the Iranian Navy is a very small navy, but they do have some ability to cause threats, in particularly their submarine force, which is a bit outdated with 3 older Russian Kilo submarines. Their smaller vessels are really more toward harassment. You may remember a few weeks ago that a U.S. flagged tanker entering through the Straits of Hormuz came under harassment from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That was met immediately by a U.S. destroyer and U.S. aircraft coming overhead. So eliminating the Iranian Navy is a big threat. I think one of the big concerns that if I was concerned about the Iranians closing the straits or interdicting trade is being able to get out there and lay mines. Mines are the ones that are going to be the biggest problem if they ever do that. We saw the use of mines during the very end of the tanker war in the 1980s and led to the damage of a U.S. Frigate, the Samuel B. Roberts, and actually led to Operation Praying Mantis, which was the last time the U.S. Navy targeted the Iranian Navy.
I was going to ask you about how Iran would actually close this. And you mentioned kind of those assets that they might put out there. Is there anything else that ships, vessels are monitoring in that area?
Well, I mean, you have shore-based missiles, obviously, is going to be a big issue, so they can do those style of attacks. The mines are really the great interdiction operation that comes out because mines are blind to whoever ships are out there. And it doesn't take actually any mines to create a minefield, just a threat of mines. And then you have to sit there and take the time to get rid of them. And that's a very slow, laborious process. The US and the British have reduced their mine sweeping capabilities. The US have just deployed 3 new littoral combat ships to the area with mine sweeping gear on board. But what it would do, what the mines would do really is not so much be a threat to shipping as much as slow everything down. And that causes the economic impact to the Western nations and to the, basically the first world, where is very dependent on the export of that oil out of Iran to fuel their economies. And it's a definite last ditch move by the Iranians to do that. It really depends on how much Iran wants to ratchet this up in terms of the oceanic fight that's taking place right now in the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, and out in the Arabian Sea.
How much of it is a priority for the Trump administration, for the United States, for the global world economy to make sure the strait is open? Where does it rank, obviously? How high of a priority should it be?
I think, in terms of our trade, we don't get as much oil from there, almost any right now. We've become very energy independent, which means we don't do it. But the rest of the world, and I mentioned East Asia, South Asia, also Europe gets it. Whenever you cause disruptions in a global commodity market, doesn't matter where it's located, it has an impact globally, and it's going to resonate across that. And so I think for the US, it's extremely important to get that pipeline back open into the Persian Gulf, to get the straits clear, to make sure that ships can begin to pass. I expect Monday morning, we're going to see very busy work in London and across the world in the maritime insurance offices, getting new insurance brokered for these ships. And I imagine there'll be some coordination with the US Fifth Fleet and commands in that area to start reopening the strait, start sending ships back through.
What signals are you looking for? Because you mentioned some of these ships are sidelined; they're almost kind of put off on this, parked on the side of the Strait of Hormuz. What signals are you looking for that you'll see to have them go back and start some of the pathways moving to and fro as they might before? Is there anything that you're keeping your eye on in that regard?
Yeah, watching right now the number of basically empty ships inside the Persian Gulf. There are a large number of ships that come into the Persian Gulf and then they kind of sit and wait to fill up in the berths throughout the Persian Gulf. So as those numbers begin to decline, that becomes a bit of an issue because there's only so much shoreside storage areas to do that. They're eventually going to have to start coming out and start bringing in empty vessels into the area. I'm watching actually the Iranians in the Karg Island facility. They are still loading tankers there. So, I mean, that tells you right there that they envision that they're going to be able to move oil tankers out in the near future. So, really, I expect here in the beginning of the week to start seeing some ship movements through the straits again. Again, the Iranians have not closed it. It's just literally the shipping companies have decided to kind of take a break, wait a minute, let things kind of settle down. Hopefully, there'll be a resolution. But if not, they're going to insure themselves and they're going to head through the straits.
Yeah, they might be back to business as usual no matter what else is happening. Sal, anything else you're keeping your eye on? It's so fascinating to talk about this. What else are you monitoring right now?
Well, I think the big issue there was that issue I mentioned to you before about the dark fleet. I mean, you're seeing how the energy market, especially in tankers, is being targeted. The U.S. has seized, over 10 tankers from Venezuela. We've just seen several tankers being seized by France and other countries from the dark fleet. This is a very big issue. There was an interesting move by a company called Sinocor out of South Korea, along with Mediterranean Shipping Company, to really corner the market on VLCCs, these very large crude carriers. And I think this is really raising a lot of people's awareness to how important energy distribution is on the high seas and why, again, goes back into something President Trump has talked about with the recently released Maritime Action Plan, why the United States really needs to start creating its own domestic fleet, shipbuilding, why it's really a huge national security issue when it comes to ocean shipping.
Yeah, and obviously it takes time to kind of turn out some of those boats and make them viable for the high seas. Sal Mercogliano, thank you so much. I appreciate your insight as always here on Live Now.